So hello everybody. Today we have a very interesting guest and I hope our conversation will be very interesting because let me introduce my guest. It's William Browder, is a financier and political activist. He's a CEO and co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management, the investment advisor to the Hermitage Fund. And more of this, he is a publisher and he's a writer, and his new book is called Freezing Order. It's all about the true story of money laundering by Russian Federation and the true story of what's going on in the Kremlin, Putin's environment. So hello.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. And my first question will be maybe hard for you, but anyways, from what I saw from a lot of articles in the internet and the free published, you are called in the press as a Putin's #1 enemy. And as we know, Putin doesn't love his enemies, and more of this, he doesn't tolerate them. So in the first chapter of your book, you describe the experience of your short-term detention in Madrid in 2018 in violation of all norms of international and domestic law, but you were released. And my question is, what is your strength and what is your power, and how many more persons like you who are still being enemy of Vladimir Putin, #1, can speak openly, freely today and still be sitting in front of me?
Well, so first of all, I should say that when the book was published and when we conceived the book, I probably was Putin's #1 enemy. He really had me like in his head. But I think that we can all safely say that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is Putin's #1 enemy now, and perhaps Alexei Navalny is his #2 enemy. But I think I still have the #3 slot in his head, and it's been a long, hard struggle. He's hated me ever since I passed the Magnitsky Act, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of his cronies and human rights violators in Russia, and this happened in 2012. And so Putin has been chasing me all around the world. The incident you just described in Madrid was based on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant, and there have been 8 of them since the Magnitsky Act was passed. I live in London, and they've also made numerous, probably a dozen or so requests to the British government for mutual legal assistance and extradition. I've been warned by the Department of Justice that there is a kidnapping plot to try to illegally render me and take me back to Moscow. And of course, there is the incident in the summit between Trump and Putin when Putin asked Trump to hand me over. And so it's been a long fight, and it's not easy. And part of the reason why Putin has been going after me so aggressively is that it's not just to punish me, but he needs to make an example out of me, because if I can stand up to him and I can cause him all these problems and I can create sanctions and all these types of things, if other people started to emulate me, then his power completely crumbles. And so he's one of these people who he lives by the jail yard creed, which is that if nobody can disrespect him, because the moment that somebody disrespects a jail yard person, then everybody thinks they're weak and then they pile on to them. And so it's been a constant struggle. I'm lucky to be alive. It's been 13 years since this whole fight has began. And it's primarily, I think my survival has been, well, I guess 2 things. One is that I've been very vigilant and I've been taking all sorts of precautions to make it difficult for them. And 2, they're not very good at this. They're awful, mean, murderous people in Putin's regime, but they're also very incompetent. And of course, you have seen that on a much broader theater of military intervention, how bad they are, but they're bad at everything they do. And that's part of the reason why I'm still here today.
We will talk about the development of the history that you're talking about, the Magnitsky Act. But first, let me ask some lyrics about Putin himself. So, talking about enemies, do you think Putin realizing himself as the enemy number one for himself, and what he's doing right now, he's committing a suicide of his own enemy, I mean himself. And do you think it will be just about him, or it will affect all the environment of Putin as well?
Well, so what we need to understand about Putin is that he's not like you or me or anyone watching this show. He's a verified psychopath. What is a psychopath? If you look it up in the physician's desk reference book, a psychopath is somebody who doesn't have any empathy, so his heart won't beat faster if someone's being tortured to death in front of him. A psychopath is a person who doesn't have any conscience, and a psychopath is a person only concerned for their own well-being and their own survival. So that is Vladimir Putin. And why is he, in my opinion, the reason that he's at war right now with Ukraine is not because of NATO, a fear of NATO enlargement, or because he's trying to build a bigger Russian empire for his legacy. I think he's at war in Ukraine because he's a dictator who has stolen so much money over the last 22 years from his own people that he's afraid that at some moment the whole thing will explode. Like we're watching on TV, for example, in Iran right this minute. They killed, one person in a police station, and the whole country is now on the verge of revolution. And that's what Putin is afraid of in Russia. And so I believe he started this war in Ukraine very simply to distract his people away from him towards essentially a fictitious enemy. The Ukrainian people, I think you're correct in your assessment that he is, signing his own death warrant. Now, the one thing I should point out is that, and I speak from a position of experience in a conflict with this man, is that one never should underestimate Putin, no matter what kind of successes you have in this battle. Putin, he has unbelievable capacity to inflict pain on his own people in order to inflict pain on his enemy. And so if this requires sending another 500,000 men into battle to die just to keep the war going so he doesn't lose, he would do that, and it wouldn't affect him at all. And so he is on the ropes right now.
Actually, I wanted to talk about this at the end of our interview, but you started this. That's why I remember you once said in some interview that for Putin or for dictators like him, there's no end game in this process. So how do you think, who may end or change the rules of games that Putin is playing? Anyways, I don't even understand what game he's playing. But if he doesn't stop this game, who will stop it?
Well, I think the Ukrainians will stop this game. So if you successfully, if the troops in Ukraine successfully push the Russian troops back to the February 24th borders, or maybe even further, back to 2014 borders, the Russian people will have no more patience for this. The Russian people like a strong man, but they absolutely don't like a strong man who loses. They can't stand a loser. The Russian people will take care of Putin very quickly if he fails in Ukraine. And so Ukraine is really doing a service far greater than protecting yourself. You're doing a service, you're losing men and economics and everything that goes along with it for the whole world, because Putin wouldn't stop in Ukraine. He would be the next stop at the Estonian border, pointing his guns at Estonia to see how serious America and Europe is about being part of NATO. So it's at this point, the only hope the world has is for Ukraine to succeed.
What else I've read from your speeches, from your interview, you once said that 95% of what's going on is upon the Kremlin and upon the Russia Federation, and 5% is upon world politicians, elites, or whatever. But on the other ways, you say it's useless to hit Putin himself by the sanctions and so on. And as we see from now, it's maybe even useless to hit the oligarchs because much more money comes from the European Union for the export of energy resources. And it's withdrawal from the budget, this money, and get it to the war, to continue the war. Like say, what can push Putin out of his stage if it's not oligarchs and if it's not his own nation and his own society?
So the West has been doing more now than they've ever done before. Sanctions are to starve Putin of the money that he needs in order to fight the war and kill Ukrainians. Basically, we need to cut off the money that he's getting. And sanctions have helped. I mean, so we've frozen what I would call the savings of Russia. This is these $350 billion of central bank reserves and the assets of oligarchs all over the world. And those oligarchs, by the way, hold Putin's money. But you're absolutely correct that every day Russia receives $1 billion in revenue from the sale of oil and gas. And every day they spend $1 billion killing Ukrainians. And so what are we going to do about that? And interestingly, coming back to your first question, Putin is doing something that we in the West don't seem to have the stomach to do, which is he's shut off the pipeline. Mm-hmm. He shut off the pipeline. And so Gazprom exports to Europe make up 25% of the Russian government budget. And he's now effectively sanctioned himself, something that we never had the stomach to do. So that's pretty impressive and helpful to us, even if he did it. I think that going forward.
Anyways, as you just said, elites, world elites, and their decision changes as time goes by. So, going back in time to 2012, you wrote that back in that times that Putin was already financially planning this war with Ukraine. And therefore, this Magnitsky Act and the freezing of certain funds of the oligarchs really interfered with him and with his decisions. But why? But why was intelligence data and evidence like yours not enough to prevent the development events? More of this. You always remind in your interviews about Chechnya, about Georgian war, about annexion of Crimea, about Donbass, about catastrophe of MH17, deaths and trying to killings in Salisbury, and more, many more in Syria, actually. So we can go on a lot. How much time has to pass then the politicians of top leading countries will finally understand with whom they are dealing?
I think that the politicians today understand who they're dealing with. I mean, it was a wake-up call on February 24th for all sorts of politicians who completely and utterly failed over the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, a complete and absolute policy failure. And as you rightly say, and I was screaming from the rooftops for years, that we need to get tough with Putin, that if we started to react to the invasion of Georgia, the invasion of Crimea, the shooting down of MH17 and so on, if we had given Putin a real taste of what our medicine was like, he might have had a second opinion, a different opinion, a revised view on what to do based on his view. He wouldn't have gone into Ukraine perhaps. And, Putin, everybody makes calculations based on risk and reward. For Putin, the reward was elevated approval ratings and safety, and he ended up being wrong. And the trouble is that now he can't back out. And so the only option is to totally destroy him. The trouble with that option, and it's the only option, is that there will be many casualties on both sides in that process. Nobody had any illusions about it. Everyone just thought they could just, push the problem down the road and keep on getting the money.
Talking about your activity right now, it's absolutely obvious, and your goal is absolutely open and clear from what you say openly from television and other mass media. It is in the freezing order book and in your speeches openly, whether it is being achieved today, because the executioners, the people who killed actually Sergei Magnitsky, are still not punished, although they are revealed. Actually, we know their names. There is a war in Ukraine, as we talk about right now. And the Kremlin's policy is not changing in any ways. So maybe you will have more vision of the effectiveness of the activity of this Magnitsky Act, not only in Russia, but in other countries that take part in this, that signed this act.
Well, so the Magnitsky Act is hugely powerful because money is the root of all problems, and the Magnitsky Act freezes money, and it freezes the money particularly of dictators and kleptocrats like Putin and his cronies who do terrible things in Russia and then try to keep their money safely in the West. When the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, Putin made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And as you mentioned before, I think he knew as early as 2012 that he was going to do something dramatic and dangerous and horrible, probably to Ukraine. What I'd like to see, and I think this would be a hugely important step, is that after the $1 trillion of damage that Russia has done to Ukraine, there's going to be money needed to fix everything. And where's the money going to come from? I think the Russians should pay. Mm-hmm. And nicely now we have money in our possession that we can use for them to pay for it. And so one of my big goals right now is to convince lawmakers around the world that this money should be repurposed from not just frozen.
Talking about how the politicians and how the attitude of countries changed, it's interesting because from what I see from not far away news, one of the latest high-profile cases that you actively cover in the media is Swiss or Switzerland. I will quote you. This is a quote from International Division of Swiss Public Non-State Television and Radio Company. So you're saying the authorities must behave differently if they want to show, of course, Switzerland is not Russia's pocket. Corrupt Russian officials have parked in Switzerland, a secretive and wealthy Alpine state, millions and millions of money stolen from their homeland. So you are trying to pay again much attention to the Magnitsky Act investigation, and what action in all of this Switzerland take part of, and why it's so influential in this situation?
Well, Switzerland is one of the countries that has the largest amount of Russian money stashed in Swiss banks. Based on what they publicly disclose, the Swiss Bankers Association publicly has said that the amount of Russian money in Switzerland is between $200 billion and $250 billion. This is what they admit to. And so if that's what they're saying publicly, I think the number is probably 500 billion or maybe more. And we also know that when this war started, the Swiss raised their hand and said, we're going to cooperate with the allied countries, and if they're going to freeze oligarch assets, so are we. And so all of a sudden they made this big announcement as if they're somehow legitimate partners. And then they froze 7 billion of the 200 or 250 billion that they admit to. Mm-hmm. And then a few days later, they said, well, actually, 4 billion of the 7 we can't really freeze. And so they've frozen 3 billion of 200 or 250, whatever you believe, which is a de minimis amount of money. And why are they not freezing the rest? Why are they not being aggressively going after all this money? And the answer is that the Swiss have a history of this. The Swiss, remember when Jews put money in the Swiss bank before and during the Holocaust to try to protect their wealth, and then they died and their relatives showed up, and the Swiss said, sorry, I don't know who you're talking about, and kept the money for themselves. And that was a huge scandal. It took many decades to resolve. and it was only after public humiliation and embarrassment that it was resolved. My own experience with Switzerland is even worse. That we found money connected to the Magnitsky case going to Switzerland. We filed a criminal complaint with the Swiss law enforcement authorities 10 years ago, more actually. They froze the money. And then it turned out that one of the key people involved in investigating the case was bribed by the Russians. Mm-hmm. And I don't just say that. The Swiss discovered it. The Swiss authorities discovered it. He was fired. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. And even after all of that, the Swiss have decided in principle, they haven't done it yet, to return most of the money that was frozen back to the criminals in Russia. And so this is a bad country. You said it's the case of past, but today I found the investigation of anti-corruption watchdog. It's Mark Piff. He wrote a book, Gold Laundering and the Dirty Secrets of the Gold Trade and How to Clean Up. So he's talking about the beneficence that Switzerland got during its neutrality in World War II by purchasing vast amounts of gold from allied and Axis powers. So they earn almost 79% of German gold delivered to foreign countries and made a lot of money in this. So it's not the question of past, it's question of nowadays. And more of this, I see from your investigations another names of banks and countries. For example, Denmark, you remind Danske Bank and Sampo Bank, where there were found billions, I mean, $234 billion that was stolen, as I understand, from Russian population, from Russian nation money and delivered to these banks. So maybe it's the question not of the past, of the nowadays. Until nobody punished, there's no future. No, I think that you know, the West has been very sort of noble in announcing sanctions, but there have been no serious reforms in the system that allowed the Russian gangsters, Russian politicians, Russian organized crime to launder hundreds of billions of dollars to the West. And so, as you mentioned, we found $234 billion of money that was laundered through Danske Bank in Estonia. And that's been documented, that's been researched, that's been proven. We don't have the research and the documentation on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna, where we know an enormous amount of money was laundered. Nor do we have that same evidence for what's happened behind the doors of UBS and Credit Suisse in Switzerland or Deutsche Bank in Germany. I believe that the total amount of money that's been stolen from the Russian people and then laundered into the West, where it now sits, is $1 trillion. And there have been absolutely almost zero prosecutions, seizures, etc., of that money. In fact, I can tell you that where I live in London, the British law enforcement authorities have not conducted one single investigation into Russian money laundering and Russian organized crime here since Putin came to power. And this is probably the largest recipient of dirty money from Russia. Let's specify if it started from exclusively Russia and Russian corruption system, but now it acts not only for Russia, but for any country that are corrupted and taking and laundering money in other countries, right? So, I mean, it's globally. It's a global Magnitsky Act. Mm-hmm. You know, there's horrible things going on in Myanmar. And the Magnitsky Act has sanctioned a bunch of generals in Myanmar. And so it goes after bad guys everywhere. It's a great way to create a disincentive, a powerful disincentive for people to commit crimes and act on the orders of dictators. You know what's upsetting me as well, that I wrote from your previous far away interviews, one of the surnames that now is very popular as a one of the oppositional leaders in Russia, and talking about all the environment of Putin and how it may change if he will be eliminated from the power. It's Khodorkovsky.
I found out from your stories that you was one who investigated with your company the corruption scams of Khodorkovsky, and all the story, how he was in jail and how he stayed in jail, and after this man is now one of the oppositioners. So do you see any clean people? You know Russia, you've been living there for about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, so you know Russians very good. Is there anybody to talk to after the elimination of Putin?
Well, so first of all, let me say that Khodorkovsky was one of the 22 oligarchs who ruled Russia before Putin came to power, and he was one of my biggest enemies in that period of time. And when they arrested him, I thought, great, one down, 21 to go. But then Putin didn't arrest any more oligarchs. He put Khodorkovsky in jail so he could become the biggest oligarch himself. And Khodorkovsky was effectively politically prosecuted. He spent 10 years in jail. He came out of jail. And in my opinion, he paid any debt he had to society and more since he was politically persecuted. And we're now friends and allies in this fight. And we have been for a number of years since he was released in 2014. And so he's one of the strongest opposition people to Putin. But I would say that there are several others that would be helpful. The biggest and the most well-known is Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny, if he were the choice of the Russian people after Putin and his regime falls, Alexei Navalny would end the war and he would rebuild relations with the West. And I'm sure of that. And so that is, we also have my good dear friend, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is a big character in my book. They tried to poison him twice in Russia, tried to kill him with poison because he was so active helping to pass the Magnitsky Act all over the world. He went back, he went back to Russia, protested the war from Russia, was on CNN calling Putin a murderer. An hour later, he was arrested. They first charged him with the crime of calling the war a war, 9 years. Then they charged him with being a member of an undesirable organization, another 5 years. He's up to 14. And as you just mentioned, 2 days ago, they charged him with treason, another 22 years. I can guarantee you that if Putin was eliminated, and the Russians eliminate not just Putin, but the whole structure of his regime, because it's not Putin, it's all these people around him, and they're looking for a new leader. I could imagine Alexei Navalny being the president and Volodymyr Zelenskyy being the prime minister, and them making amends, stopping the war, of course, making amends with Ukraine, and cleaning up the relationship between Russia and the Western world. I think that there are totally reasonable people to do that, and so it's not a hopeless situation. Now, of course, if Putin is replaced, or let's say he dies in his sleep, and the system maintains itself, then you'll have some other horrible warlike monster replace him, like Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, or Shoigu, the defense minister, or one of these characters, and it'll be no different. So it's not a certainty by any means that the Putin regime falls, or if Putin falls, that the war is over. It all depends on how it falls and who comes in place next.
Can we say in this situation that the proverb works like the enemy of my enemy is my friend in this situation with Russia, unfortunately?
Well, I mean, it can get very complicated. I mean, there are certain people that are reasonable people. We know them, the ones who are the opposition. Now, Alexei Navalny has said some things which are very distasteful to Ukrainians. I think he supported the annexation of Crimea, which is a total non-starter. But he also has said very clearly and without any reservations that this war completely is illegal, irresponsible, murderous, and must stop. And I think that that's a pretty reasonable. I think you should grab onto that and be happy about that.
Mr. Browder, can I ask you a personal question? I mean, it's interesting for me. You are a businessman and financier and investor, And the very essence of the area, implies it's a profit. I mean, the goal of your activity, like a businessman, it's getting profit. So there are legal and, let's say, alternative ways to increase one's profits, and the history sometimes give a chance to people who are talented and who can use the time and place where he is to make this profit. I mean, that what happened in 90s. And post-Soviet 90s in Moscow, it's like, it's just the time where you started your career in Russian Federation, an investor. Your investments of your company was the biggest, the largest at that times, right? And my question is, I've read from your interview in Snob magazine in 2011, where you write, in the period from 1999 to 2003, we succeeded a lot because our interest obviously coincided with the Putin regime, and I had the very best job in the world. That's what you said. What made you change your mind, even though you knew from the beginning all the all the controversial things that's going on in the economy of Soviet bloc that almost was dead? So, I mean, using this situation, you already knew what will bring profit to you, but you changed your mind. Why?
So when I went to Russia, I started investing in these very cheap shares, and then I discovered that all of the companies I was investing in were being robbed by the oligarchs, and so I owned a share of the companies, but I didn't have a share of anything because they were stealing all the money. And so I did something to make money which has never been done before, which is instead of accepting the corruption, I decided to challenge the corruption. And the way I challenged the corruption was researching how these guys went about the stealing and then exposing it. And so I did this, and it might not have had any impact, except that the time that I started exposing the stealing in these big Russian companies was the same time that Vladimir Putin came to power. And Putin, when he came to power, wasn't the all-confident, all-powerful tyrant that he is today. He was very meek, and he was meek because all the oligarchs had stolen the power from him. So the oligarchs were stealing money from me, and they were stealing power from Putin. And I've never met Vladimir Putin. I didn't meet him then. I've never met him since then. But we had an alignment of interests because he was fighting with the oligarchs at the same time I was fighting with the oligarchs. And to use a word that you mentioned previously, this was one of these expressions, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so as I would expose the oligarchs, he would step in and he would crush them the best he could. And as a result, my investments started going up in value. And as you quoted me, it was the best job in the world. I could make Russia a better place and make money at the same time. And I wished it went on forever. But unfortunately, Putin wasn't sincere in getting rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. And to use the name of Khodorkovsky you mentioned before, he arrested Khodorkovsky, who was the biggest oligarch, put him on trial, allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial, sitting in a cage. And the rest of the oligarchs went to Putin and said, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said, real simple, 50%. And that was the moment Putin became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that our interests diverged, because I was still trying to fight the corruption. But instead of fighting the corruption, I was now fighting Putin. And after that, I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, started to investigate. He discovered the raid of the offices led to a $230 million government corruption scheme. He exposed it. And in retaliation, he was arrested, tortured for 358 days in Russian police detention, and murdered on November 16, 2009. And so my experience with Putin has been one where when he showed his true face, it turned out to be the most criminal and corrupt face you can imagine. And people talk about Putin as some type of statesman who's trying to, maybe we don't like it, but he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. That's not at all the case. Putin is just a crook, a common financial criminal. And his actions are consistent with that all the way from the very beginning, and I can prove it. And his motivations are of a criminal just trying to keep his money and trying to survive. Well, the reason he's as powerful as he is not because he's all that powerful, is because we give him the power. We act scared. We try to appease him, and so I think that the key to succeed is for the West not to give Putin this power, not to give him an off-ramp, not to give him face-saving the way that Emmanuel Macron is trying to do. It's just to beat back to his place and let the Russians take care of him when he gets there.
At the end of your book, you are writing your thoughts about why do Ukrainians need the important story of Magnitsky, and why we should all read, I mean, who have a wish, we can read this book. It's open in internet, in the Ukrainian language, actually. We can find it. We will leave the link to your book to read. So why it's so important and how it can change the situation in Ukraine for now.
Well, I think that probably the most powerful part of my story for Ukrainians, putting aside all the financial, the thriller part where you might think about how the Russians launder their money, but the most powerful part of my story for Ukrainians is my story is about how one man without a lot of power has been able to stand up to Vladimir Putin and so far survive and succeed in causing him real trouble. And I think that Ukrainians should understand that that you can stand up to Putin, and you can stand up to Russia, and you have been standing up, and it's been working. And it's I think it will give you some inspiration to carry on with your own fight, because your own fight is destined to succeed because you care. You have the moral high ground and a moral mission to defend yourself and to fight off these terrible, murderous invaders.
Thank you very much for your work. Thanks for your honest dialogue, your honest answers, and I wish you strong and health. And I wish that you will find a lot of people like you, because as much people like you, the faster we will change something in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I just remind our audience that we had a talk with William Browder, a financier, politician, activist, and the writer, the publisher of the book that is called Freeze and Order, that you can find on the internet. The link we will leave you. So stay with us, and will be more.